Hey everybody! Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to another episode in our Season 2 finale series in which we're recapping major genre groups across the 1990s. In today's episode, we're talking about Western popular rock music. So, all the sorts of rock music that you might have heard on the radio in the United States or Europe. Just as a reminder, this is a series of episodes in which I'm recapping, as I said, major genre groups across the entire decade. And so if you're interested in listening to any of the other episodes that I've been doing in this finale series, feel free to go check them out. As well, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that we talk about in today's episode, feel free to check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of this episode here. As well, if you're looking for my big list for all of the 1990s, I'll be dropping that when I drop the last episode in this finale series, so keep your eyes out for that. So what are we going to talk about today? As usual with this finale series, we're going to be reviewing what we recapped in the 1980s for Western popular rock music, which in the 1980s recap we just called rock music. Next, we're going to be overviewing the subgenres that we'll be talking about today, and then we're going to dive into each subgenre with milestone songs across the decade and why we chose them. So to start off with, let's talk about the 1980s recap for a second. The songs that we used to elicit the evolution of rock music across the 1980s started with Queen, Another One Bites the Dust. Next, the Psychedelic Furs, Pretty in Pink. Next, U2, Sunday Bloody Sunday. Next, Gene Loves Jezebel, Always a Flame. Next, Sonic Youth, Tom Violence. Next, Dinosaur Jr., Sludge Feast. Next, Pixies, Where Is My Mind? And then finally, Nirvana, About a Girl. So that was a lot of songs that we talked about, wasn't it? It was 8 songs. Definitely a lot more than the typical 3 that I was affording myself when I was talking about where things started, where things peaked, and where things ended. And the reality is that if you actually did listen to that 1980s recap, you probably detected that I had to do a lot of justification work trying to leap across genres in order to explain just what the heck was happening with rock music across the 1980s. For example, if you start with Queen, Another One Bites the Dust, that's a different era of rock music. Some might even call it metal music if they were really stretching it out far enough. Psychedelic Furs, Pretty in Pink, that's the first era of neo-psychedelic rock that was happening in the 80s, really early stage stuff. U2, that was its own flavor of rock music that was coming out of Ireland, and it was its own thing. It didn't sound anything like Psychedelic Furs. It was its own movement and subgenre. Gene Loves Jezebel, that was more on the new wave rock side. Sonic Youth, that was the second wave of alternative rock. Pixies, also second wave of alternative rock, but we were going in meaningful directions that would eventually get us to things like grunge. And then Nirvana, About a Girl, was very proto-early grunge, where you could detect those connection points from Pixies to where they would eventually go into the 90s. It was just all over the map, which is to say that the experience that I had doing the 1980s recap around rock really told me a lot about how, across the entirety of season 2, I needed to break things down more acutely by subgenres within greater genres and then waves within the subgenres, or else we were never going to be able to talk about these things in a clear-cut fashion and really follow the trajectory. So because of that, I just put on a pedestal that the rock era of the 1980s showed me that although the way that we did things in the 1990s was a little convoluted and hard to track, and it made doing this 1990s recap endlessly challenging and complicated for me, I think because of it, though, we have a better sense and understanding of just what the heck happened, not just with rock music, but across all these genres that we've been talking about. So I honor that. Then leading into the subgenres that we're going to talk about today. So juxtaposing Western popular rock music from Western underground music. So I split them up into 2 different moments for good reason, because there was just so much rock music that was happening across the 90s, and there was a very clear delineation and separation between what was on the radio and what wasn't necessarily on the radio. What was popular and people were talking about, what was far more underground. It was just such a fertile ground for rock music that there was just enough to talk about in these 2 major buckets between the 2, which is why this time around we're not just talking about rock music. We're talking about rock that was on the radio and rock that wasn't on the radio. So for rock that was on the radio, there were 4 major genre groups that we're going to talk about here, which again does not encapsulate all of the rock that existed on the radio at the time, but they were the 4 major groups that had meaningful enough evolutions that we could talk about them with some degree of awareness and distinction between it and something else. So because of that, just know that if I'm not talking about some era of rock music or some subgenre of rock music that you understood to be on the radio in the 1990s or was popular at the time, we're not talking about it, I'd first encourage you to go look at my big list for the 1990s when I do drop it and see if maybe there's some representation there of that genre that you were looking for. But also, is it possible that I'm going to miss some stuff? Yeah, definitely. I totally acknowledge that right up front, even before we get to the very end of the episode where I say, what did I miss? I'm just fully laying out right now. It's totally possible that I'm missing some stuff because rock music was just so much of a creative nexus in the 90s that getting your hands all the way around it, it's an impossible task. So I'm doing what I can, and hopefully this gives you a good enough picture so that you could fill in the gaps where you see them. So the four major groups that we're going to talk about today are grunge and post-grunge, so putting it all together in one idea, neo-Brit rock, retro and neo-roots rock, and neo-psychedelic rock. So to start off with, let's talk a little bit about grunge and post-grunge. We didn't really talk a lot about post-grunge during the actual season of the 1990s because I wasn't really putting the pieces together about what post-grunge was and what its impacts were following the grunge movement. Because truthfully, as I laid it out, the thing I realized is that grunge really only existed in its pure form for the first half of the 90s, and then the second half of the 90s was just all post-grunge. And it's actually interesting too that there could be such a distinction between the genre and then the post-genre, but I guess it's the same kind of idea with punk and post-punk. Punk and post-punk are nothing alike. The beginning of post-punk might have sounded like the end of punk, but by the time it gets to its very end stage of post-punk, the end of punk and the end of post-punk sound nothing alike. So because of that, that's kind of the evolution that grunge takes, where it starts off as this thing, and then it eventually transcends into this post-genre idea, and then it just continues to evolve into this totally new thing, which will eventually carry us into the 2000s. So when we talk about grunge, to start off with, so if you go back and listen to what I said in the 1991 episode when we talked about Nirvana's Nevermind or Gish by Smashing Pumpkins, that grunge was a total amalgam of about 1,000 different ideas pulled together. There was a little bit of metal in there. There was a little bit of neo-psychedelic rock in there. There was a bit of second wave alternative rock, a la Pixies. There was some first wave in there too, thinking Husker Du. There was a little bit of root stuff in there. There was just a lot going on all at the same time with grunge. And Nirvana's Nevermind just happened to catalyze all of those things into this just wonderful, polished package that, eliciting the point about Smells Like Teen Spirit, it was just pulling 1,000 ideas together, and each one would come up for a beat or a riff or a moment, and it would move into the next idea and the next idea and the next idea. Smells Like Teen Spirit is one of those quintessentially amazing songs, not just because it's really hooky and it's got some pop elements to it and you can really sing to it and it's a total anthem and it's really great structurally, but then also it's just such a complicated idea that pulls together so many ideas so beautifully, like from a musical sonic perspective, that it just tied a little bow around so many ideas all at once and just created this whole new thing. So when we say grunge, what we mean is that amalgam of taking a little bit of hair metal, taking a little bit of heavy metal, taking a little bit of glam metal, taking a little bit of neo-psychedelic rock and alternative rock of the first two waves, and putting it together into this package that has a very distinctive sound to it, and that's just grunge. That's grunge to a T. So let's start talking about the music to help elicit some points even further here. So we're actually going to start with a song that happens in 1990 that is before grunge really finds its groove. So it's a little bit after About a Girl by Nirvana, which came out in 1989, and then in 1990, we've inched forward a little bit further, and it's less justifiably second wave alternative rock. And now it's turning into this kind of different thing, but it's still hearkening back to all of the genres and subgenres that I just laid out for you a second ago. And they're all still separated enough from one another that you can hear each piece. Like there's a little new wave, there's a little metal, there's a little bit of that neo-psychedelic, there's a little bit of alt rock. It's just a little bit more distinctive to help ground you so that when we move forward and it sounds even more smushed together into one singular idea and it's harder to detect, you could still go back to that original song and tease out all those different parts. So the song that we're talking about is Love Hate Love by Alice in Chains on their album Facelift from 1990. So as I said a second ago, you can very clearly hear all the different chunks of new wave, of heavy metal, of hair metal, of neo-psychedelic rock, of first wave and second wave alternative rock. You can hear all of those pieces coming up in how they sing, how they play their instruments, how they structure the song. It's clear, it's obvious. You can hear all of those distinctive parts, and you can hear how they're all definitely working with each other. They're all tied together in some way, but it's not mushed together into this one fused homogeneous package yet. It's not totally cohesive. There's still connective tissue that's linking it all together, and you can see all the different individual pieces. So that's a good way for us to start. And then in 1991, we actually do get to the first wave, of course, because we're talking about Smells Like Teen Spirit on Nirvana's Nevermind. So you take what Love, Hate, Love was doing a year ago, and again, it's just fused together into this just polished silver ball that is just perfect and seamless, and you have no idea what's going on beneath the surface because it's just so perfectly executed in one singular moment that unless you're a very seasoned listener of all of these different genres and you could pull it out and go, oh yeah, I could hear that, I could hear that. It just sounds like one cohesive idea that seems like it sparked from nothing. But obviously, as we know, even just listening to Love, Hate, Love, it didn't spark from nothing. There was a whole bunch of somethings that led to this also something. And really, at the end of the day, if you think about it, all Smells Like Teen Spirit did was take an idea like Love, Hate, Love, polish it up so much and buff it up so much that it's really hard to detect what all goes into this thing, and then add some pop into it, like pop hooks, and you've got Smells Like Teen Spirit. That's just what it is. So because of that, it's the official beginning of first wave grunge rock, and I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. So next, we move into 1994 with the second wave of grunge, in which the guitars are getting a little bit harder, the pop has waned a little bit, and it's focused a little bit more on just getting into that grimy, growly idea that Kurt Cobain was playing with in Smells Like Teen Spirit, and we're just kind of going harder into that. And it's also starting to a little bit incorporate the retro neo-roots rock ideas very incrementally into the sound. So all of this popular 90s rock music is starting to get a little bit closer to each other, where first wave grunge and what was happening in the retro neo-roots rock at the time, like think about Pearl Jam's 10, which came out the same year as Nirvana's Nevermind. They didn't really sound super close to each other, but by 1994, and we're getting to the second wave of grunge, they got a little bit closer to each other. They sound a little bit more similar than they did 3 years prior. So that's why this is a second wave of grunge. So the track is Everything Zen by Bush on 16 Stone, which we definitely talked about in the 1994 episode, because 16 Stone, great album. Gavin Rossdale, lead singer of Bush, was doing a very good job trying but not trying to sound like Kurt Cobain. I'm sure it wasn't on purpose. I think it was all just sort of the community of grunge was all going in one direction, and that's just what it was. I doubt very much he was on purpose trying to copy Kurt Cobain. But they sound very similar because it is the grunge sound. But at the same time, Gavin Rossdale a little bit sounds like Eddie Vedder, just a tiny bit. It's starting to get a little bit closer. So because of that, we're moving in that direction. And also at the same time, by 1984, like we said, we're getting to that pinnacle moment where people are about to get sick of just straight ahead grunge because it's been happening for the last few years already. And also, too, bands like the Smashing Pumpkins have been pushing the envelope for their last couple albums up until this point. So they've been also challenging the general grunge rock community to question exactly what grunge is, where it can go, and where it's going to go next. So it's a combination of two things. By Everything Zen, we're already, as a listenership, very familiar with what grunge is, what it does, where it goes. And there is this evolution from first to second wave, but then after that, I'd like to believe key voices in the music community around grunge were already asking those questions of, all right, we've done this idea. Let's get off this idea and go to something else. And that something else is what post-grunge becomes. So in 1995, so 1 year later, the Smashing Pumpkins come out with Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, and the track is Tonight Tonight. This is the first wave of post-grunge, and it happens right after grunge ends a little bit, to a degree that I'd like to believe Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness was one of those signposts to say that grunge was officially ending and we were going into something else new and different, because Tonight Tonight on this album wasn't the first time that Billy Corgan and the Smashing Pumpkins did something that was ambitious, that took the grunge ideas and sent them in totally different directions. They had been doing that for the last album or so already, so this isn't a surprise. But by this time, it is officially being declared by Smashing Pumpkins and Billy Corgan that grunge is over and we're moving in totally different productive directions. One thing I'll call out about Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness is that being such a large album as it is, you can find literally every wave of grunge and post-grunge, to include ones that are to come, on this album by itself. You've got tracks that do stuff that Pixies were doing back in 1988. You've got that zeroth wave, that proto wave of grunge that Alice in Chains was doing in 1990. You've got Nirvana era first wave grunge in there. You've got second wave 16 Stone era grunge in there. You've also got some first wave post grunge in there with stuff like Tonight Tonight and several others, but then also what was coming down the pike next with the second wave. So Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness was truly a triumph in the world of grunge and rock music of the 90s, just because it was basically just an anthology of the entirety of the history of grunge and what led up to it, its entire existence, and then what was going to happen next. And Billy Corgan reads to me as the kind of dude that would be like a visionary and that sort of thing. So I'm sure that this was the intent by one means or another to basically highlight the entirety of this musical saga and then also be giving a direction for where we were going next. And give the whole thing a listen, because I guarantee you that you can hear all these different little slice outs and versions and evolutions all throughout the album just in this one thing. So certainly listen to Tonight Tonight, because it is the official kickoff of post-grunge, but also just listen to the whole thing. If instead of listening to each individual track that I'm giving you on the grunge post-grunge journey, just listen to Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. You'll get the whole picture right then and there too. So next, we move a couple years into the future, because the evolution of grunge through post-grunge was very fast and furious in the 90s, with Foo Fighters, My Hero on The Color and the Shape. My Hero is a very, very, very famous track. It's probably their first major hit, as far as I can remember. This is the second wave of post-grunge, so if you take what Tonight Tonight was doing, and then add in even more heavy driving guitars, more emotion. So where grunge was more about being growlingly angry, post-grunge is sad and intense and emotional to a certain degree. Because I think that My Hero was a lot more on the pop side than Tonight Tonight was. I think Tonight Tonight was much more emotive and more intense. The orchestral component to it was really uplifting. There was a freedom to it where it felt like anything was possible coming out of grunge. It felt like grunge was blooming, where previously it was just these like really stinky, sharp, pointy weeds that existed in a good way, but that's what it was. And then Tonight Tonight comes out, and then out of those malevolent weeds and thorns comes this wonderful flower. And then eventually My Hero comes out a couple of years later, and the flower itself has really interesting petals to it. Like, it's really energizing and it is really intense, but it really charges you up and makes you feel a little less angry and a little just more excited. It's hard to explain. There is some emotion about it that I'm at a loss to express with words, but it is more uplifting if nothing else. And that's the vibe of second wave post-grunge. It's turned away from just being this beautiful thing that's come out of grunge, and it's going back into being more rock music, and it's got that intensity back, but it's still beautiful. It's beautiful and it's charged and it's intense. And then by the third wave of post-grunge in 1999, we get to American Football by American Football, and the track is Never Meant, which we definitely talked about in the 1999 episode. So interestingly enough, during this episode, I think I probably called this indie rock or something else that certainly wasn't post-grunge, because I don't think I really put together that this was post-grunge until I went on this journey through the 90s recap. And I realized that this is the direction that Pacific Northwest, West Coast grunge idea, that sound was going, where this is what the counterculture sound is in that region that will become so quintessential in the 2000s when we get to season 3. But it's really an offshoot of post-grunge, where it's gone from being intense and driving like My Hero was, and it's moving into this just more quiet, contemplative place. Not necessarily like in a self-effacing way, like how slowcore and sadcore were an offshoot of hardcore and post-punk, where they just started playing things super slow because it was counterculture to the current on-brand culture of playing post-punk music. I think that there was just this perception that you can get intense by just getting quieter and really letting your instruments and the musicality do the talking for you, and just let you really pay attention to what's happening. Because Never Meant really does sound like My Hero. They sound very similar to each other, at least in their musicality. It's just one is loud and driving, and one is quiet and contemplative, but it's definitely going in that direction. And again, if you know anything about what happens in the 2000s, this is really what it starts to sound like. So is it possible that post-grunge of the third wave will start to shoot off into indie rock? Maybe. But at least in this moment, this is where the evolution's going. So it's super interesting. I would really challenge you to listen to Tonight, My Hero, and then Never Meant, and then hear how similar they are, because there's threads that connect all three of them up together. Even Tonight and Never Meant, they have threads. And then if you go back and connect it up to the grunge, go back and listen to Love, Hate, Love, and then Never Meant. Boy, are they different, aren't they? But it's incremental changes over time because grunge really aggressively evolved over the decade. It's really amazing to have sat and listened to this and really processed it and appreciated it for what it was. So next, let's talk about Neo-Brit rock. So we call it Neo-Brit rock because I equate regular Brit rock with like the Beatles, for example, and this is a new era. It's doing approximately the same things, but it's just a new era. It's got new instrumentation, new ideas. We've passed up basically everything that the Beatles did in their entire journey. We went through the 80s and did the hopeless new wave thing, and now we're on the other side in the 90s, and we're ready to sort of revisit Brit rock as an idea that is totally separate from anything that new wave was doing for the most part. And it is going back and honoring what bands like the Beatles did during the original era of Brit rock, so Neo-Brit rock. So to start off with, we'll talk about the first wave of Neo-Brit rock, which I have no idea if this is actually the right line in the sand, but I'm just calling it here just so we have something to anchor ourselves onto. So first wave, 1993, the album is Modern Life is Rubbish by Blur, and the track is Colin Zeal, which I believe we talked about in the 1993 episode as being an essential track, because I'm pretty sure that we called out Modern Life is Rubbish. The reason that I call out Colin Zeal and not For Tomorrow, for example, which is definitely a more lively track and it hits harder than Colin Zeal does. Colin Zeal sounds more like it's harkening back to that original Brit rock idea, those Brit rock sounds, and it sounds just quintessentially British rock music, except updated for the 90s. So it's just a really good place for us to start. It just sounds desperately British. So that's why we're starting here. And it is a great song, by the way, Blur, so great. Then in 1995, we moved to the second wave of Neo-Brit rock, to Oasis, unsurprising, on What's the Story, Morning Glory, and the track is Morning Glory. I don't think we actually talked about Morning Glory when we highlighted What's the Story, Morning Glory by Oasis in the 95 episode. But Morning Glory is a really great example to show the evolution from Colin Zeal to this moment. So where Colin Zeal sounded a little tiny bit more new wave than it might have made sense in 1993, it still had little tiny bits of sounding like it was from the 80s. Teeny tiny, so tiny. But by 95 with Morning Glory, first of all, they sound very much like the Beatles. So the second evolution really was, let's just go back and experience the Beatles in a more updated way for the 1990s. And Morning Glory just sounds like the Beatles to a T, which I think is probably why everybody thought that Oasis was going to be the next Beatles, unsurprisingly. We've gone through that conversation several times since Oasis, and none of them have been right necessarily. But Morning Glory, again, it sounds very, very, very British. It's got this ease to it that sounds like a conversation that would be happening between two British people right in the morning and having that conversation with each other. So it just sounds like deeply British again. It sounds like the Beatles, more so than we've experienced thus far in this journey. And the guitars are a little punchier. They drive a little bit harder. Again, it sounds a little less like new wave runoff, and we're just leaning into the future here. It's got that wall of sound thing going on that also harkens back to the original British rock era. So it's just living out the Neo-Brit rock thing even more so. So next, let's move 3 years into the future with the third wave of Neo-Brit rock, and the track is Without You I'm Nothing on Without You I'm Nothing by Placebo. Again, it's just going even further into sounding like British rock music than we ever have before, but it's evolving and taking things in totally different interesting directions beyond Morning Glory, so you can hear those connection points between this track and Morning Glory, and even going back to Colin Zeal, you can hear those threads that connect them all together. But this one just sounds more fully realized. It sounds more polished. It also sounds a little bit more 2000s leaning, like the way that the singing sounds a little bit more 2000s-ish. It sounds like it's really setting that foundation with where the sound of British rock vocal stylings are going to go very, very shortly. So it's all getting teed up very effectively as we prepare shortly to go into the 2000s. But then before we go, in 1999, we have, I would say, even further down the lane of the third wave of Neo-Brit rock with Piano Lessons by Porcupine Tree on Stupid Dream, which we definitely did talk about in the 1999 episode. This just takes what was happening in Without You, I'm Nothing, takes it even one step further because it was a year later, and we're getting even closer to that 2000 sound. So where I said in Without You, I'm Nothing, it sounds kind of 2000s-ish, 2001, 2002, Piano Lessons just takes those ideas, first of all, and reaffirms what I just said, that it does sound like it's going into the future. And it just sounds even more like that direction. So it's just a proof of concept that where in Without You, I'm Nothing, it was going in that direction. Piano Lesson sounds even more like that. So it's just sort of proof that we are going in that direction. So it's just a really great way for us to end talking about Neo-Brit rock because it's sending you in that direction. And to that end, I am excited to talk about early to mid 2000s Neo-Brit rock because it does start to go in really fun, entertaining directions for a little while before I forget where it goes next. So I'm excited to go on that journey together. So next, let's talk about retro/neo roots rock. And really, when we talk about the retro roots rock side, we're just going to talk about it for one hot second before we get into the neo roots rock side. And the thing I'll also say before I go into this one is I had a lot of trouble putting this one together, unfortunately, because I was excited to tell the story of how this sound evolves over the course of the 90s. And frankly, I got to about 1995, and then I really struggled to find quality examples that go beyond that because they just start to kind of evaporate. And this idea of the neo roots rock sound, which if you hear any of it, like, for example, Eddie Vedder, and then anything that sounds like Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, any of that stuff, it just starts to kind of sound generically like whatever this is. And there's a bunch of bands that are all trying to sound like this. Obviously, alternative pop starts to take more control of the airwaves, and the neo roots rock that is the rock version of it starts to wane a little bit in favor of other ideas like post-grunge and the like. So it does start to wane. So when we talk about our last track here that I have as an example, it's a stretch, and I'll call it out again when we get to it, but it's a stretch. So the first track we're going to start off with is actually the what I call proto version because it is the retro roots rock side of things. And it's in 1990. And the track is Follow Your Heart by the Paladins on their album Let's Buzz. Just listen to this. I would say just turn this off first of all and go listen to it right now. I'll wait. Okay, you back? So the thing is that obviously this sounds like it came from 1950 something, 1960 something, like the origination of rock and roll music. And yet it's 1990. But the thing is that the way that the Paladins sound, like their sound, does a little bit sound like they're going in roots rock directions that are leaning forward. The singer kind of a little bit sounds like it's got an Eddie Vedder vibe to it. Like there's clear markers of where this is going to be going. But for the most part, the point of this song being on the list where it is just to show you that in this moment in time in the 88 to 91 timeline, there was this interest in tapping into retro roots rock ideas like the Allman Brothers or what have you. And that interest eventually led to bands like Pearl Jam and the like taking it in this neo direction that was relevant for the 90s, was new for a whole new generation of people. So the likelihood that there were a ton of young people in the 90s that were listening to Pearl Jam when they were like 8 or 9 that knew anything about the Allman Brothers, like sub 5%. So because of that, this was just brand new information to them, myself included back at the time, because I didn't really process any of that until much later when I started to listen to Allman Brothers a lot more. And I said, wait, this kind of sounds like literally everything that was on the radio in the early 90s. And the answer is yeah, basically. So that's the reason that we include this grounding track of Follow Your Heart by the Paladins. And it's a really excellent song, by the way. Check it out now if you didn't check it out when I stopped for a second and let you go listen to it. So next, we go 1 year into the future and we hit 1991 with 10 by Pearl Jam, and the track is Jeremy, which is one of their major hits from the very beginning of their run. It's the first official wave of neo roots rock, and it basically kicked off the popularity around everybody taking up this sound. Everybody that was in the alternative pop side that was doing sounds unlike this beforehand, taking this idea and then that becoming what alternative pop is. It was a total ground shift. And Jeremy is a really great song. It sounds basically like Allman Brothers, except it's going a little bit grungier and a little bit harder, but it's essentially the same idea, same blueprint, same roadmap. And that's approximately what it is. So then we move 3 years into the future with the second wave of neo roots rock to Interstate Love Song, super popular song by Stone Temple Pilots on their album Purple. This is a clear evolution where Jeremy sounded more grungy. This sounds less grungy by comparison, especially because, as we know from a bit ago here, grunge started to lose its strength and its hold on the rock and metal communities right around 1994, going into 95. So it's clear Stone Temple Pilots in this case was starting to evolve out of it too, through the neo roots rock ideas and moving away from grunge and maybe even moving into a more post-grunge moment, or maybe rediscovering punk elements. But there was certainly less commitment to the Pearl Jam's 10 ideas about what neo roots rock needed to be, because I bet money that there was a commitment in the community to sounding like that for at least 91, 92, 93. And by 94, yeah, we were still committed to it to a certain extent, but you could really hear that they're starting to break away into something else. And then by 1997, again, calling out that this is only an okay example to elicit the point, we get to a third wave of neo roots rock with RPM by Sugar Ray on their album Floored, which was before they really started to get going. So this song is an evolution off of neo roots rock, absolutely. But it's maybe only 40% of that evolution into something else, and the rest of it is Mark McGrath showing his encyclopedic knowledge of music and just taking up 7,000 ideas and merging it together into this one complex package. Not necessarily exactly like Smells Like Teen Spirit, because this is a lot rawer than that. Like, there's a lot more going on. There's a wild amount of experimentation in this track. And Mark McGrath is, in one way or another, some sort of musical genius that does really complexly and deeply understand music. But also there's like this half commitment to it. Like, he really knows a lot and he really tries to throw a lot of really interesting, cool ideas in his music. But two, I just don't think he always commits to the bit so much. And so RPM has a lot of really great, interesting experimentational ideas around neo roots rock, taking it into the future. But then there's also like a lot of other stuff thrown in there. So listen to RPM, try and tease out where it's taking things further than Interstate Love Song did, and also obviously Pearl Jam's Jeremy. But beyond that, you might want to leave the rest of it by the door, unless you're really into what's going on here, which is totally cool, because I find Sugar Ray and Mark McGrath to be endlessly intriguing, because he clearly does really understand music very deeply and complexly, but then it doesn't always come to fruition in clear-cut packages that are easily consumed by listeners. And then sometimes he just swings the far other way and just does essentially alternative pop music, right? He's an interesting guy. I always like giving a spotlight to Mark McGrath because he's just a really interesting dude. Nonetheless, RPM does have some granules and little tiny nuggets of the future in there, and evolution even as of 1997. So give that one a listen to just kind of capstone this whole thing about neo roots rock. And then finally, let's talk about neo-psychedelic rock. So neo-psychedelic rock has been going on at this point since the early 80s. And the interesting thing is that at that time, it was basically still just doing psychedelic rock and wasn't in this neo-psychedelic rock moment. It was probably like a later stage wave of psychedelic rock, but it wasn't neo-psychedelic rock, because I don't necessarily think we got to the neo side until probably the 90s. So what Psychedelic Furs were doing, or Echo and the Bunnymen, was certainly some degree of psychedelic rock. But like I said, I think it was just more of an evolution off of the old way versus a totally different new way. And the totally different new way starts around 89 to 92-ish. I'd like to believe that bands like My Bloody Valentine really brought forward the neo-psychedelic rock movement, even if it was in its proto stages, where our first artist that we're going to talk about here in 1992 with the first wave, Catherine Wheel, on their album Ferment, the track Texture really gives you a sense, first of all, of how we're connected back to the 80s, because this does a little bit sound like late stage Psychedelic Furs. It sounds like late stage new wave. It's got the haunting vocals that My Bloody Valentine was going for. It's just got a little bit more of a shape to it, and it's got a little bit more of a perspective to it, which is why I'm calling it out as neo-psychedelic rock, the first wave. It's a really great song, by the way. Catherine Wheel, we did not talk about hardly at all, if at all, but I kept 2 or 3 of their albums on my big lists across the decade. So if you really like this track, go and check out the rest of what they're doing, because it's fun, interesting stuff for the beginning of the 90s, at least, in neo-psychedelic rock. So next, in the same exact year, 1992, we go from that first wave to the second wave. So this is to say, too, that Catherine Wheel's Ferment, the track Texture, was late stage first wave, because as I said, it had been going on from like 88-ish up until this moment. So it was primed to evolve. So we baselined with Texture, and now we're talking about the second wave with If I Were With Her Now on the album Laser Guided Melodies by Spiritualized. And we definitely talked about this album on the 1992 episode. So this is second wave. We probably talked about it being this really great transcendent album because it was taking things in a really great direction. I don't think we necessarily mentioned that Spiritualized was an offshoot of Spacemen 3, so they were back from the 80s. We didn't really talk about Spacemen 3 hardly at all. I might have kept an album or two, maybe not, but Spiritualized was an offshoot and an evolution. So Spiritualized was taking things in a really awesome direction. Obviously, if we're talking about 1992 and they're already shooting off into the second wave, that means that they were doing something meaningful and ambitious. So we're honoring that. It sounds far spacier because Spacemen 3 was very much proto-space rock. And now we're just taking that even further. It sounds more airy and, ironically enough, more textured than Texture was. It's got these threads and open spaces between a lot of the notes to just let some of these notes breathe even more, which is to a degree the space rock idea, but it's where neo-psychedelic rock was going. It was just opening up all of these negative spaces between the notes and the beats and the singing and just giving this space for things to just hang for a second. And it was, as a result, very airy and light and fluffy and intense, but it was fluffy. And so because of that, Spiritualized is taking it in that very legitimately meaningful direction with If I Were With Her Now. So then 3 years later, we get to our third wave with Radiohead, unsurprising, with The Bends, also unsurprising, and the track is Planet Telex. This is, in my opinion, the first huge launch pad for them. Pablo Honey had come out a year or two before and they had Creep on there, but it wasn't exactly neo-psychedelic rock. Planet Telex and The Bends broadly is really leaning into neo-psychedelic rock. Like Tom York is figuring something out around where this sound is going and he's taking it there and he's totally commanding it and he's totally in charge of it. And Radiohead, even during the Bends era, was taking utter control over the neo-psychedelic rock movement of the 90s. So this is really just them completely owning it. Planet Telex sounds even more fully realized than If I Were With Her Now 3 years prior. Again, it sounds even sharper. Those connective points between the negative space is even clearer, even more complex. So it's like an atom where there's a couple electrons floating around and there's, a couple protons and neutrons and everything like that. And then Planet Telex is just a much more complex atom that's got even more going on. So there's a lot of critical negative space that's happening between the electrons going around this atom. And it's got even more meat in the middle that they're rotating around. I'm giving a little bit of a science lesson here, but it's just got even more to it. It's heavier, it's deeper, it's more complex. There's more going on. And the spaces between the atoms is even more charged with energy. So it's just doing that even more so. And then 2 years later, we get to the fourth wave with Radiohead yet again on OK Computer, to zero people's surprise, hopefully. And the track is Paranoid Android, rightly so. Because for a lot of OK Computer, it's still third wave like Planet Telex is. But Paranoid Android specifically is fourth wave. They're leaning out with Paranoid Android because there's even more going on there. The level of complexity of the song and the journey that you go on is undeniable. There's so much more going on here, even more so than Planet Telex, and also even more than literally every other track that is on OK Computer. No shade to that album because basically every track on that album is a miracle. Paranoid Android is like three miracles stapled together. It's just insane. There's so much going on there, and rightly so that it's one of their most famous tracks of all time because it is just three miracles stapled together, as I said. So putting the superfluous things that I'm saying about it aside, the atom structure, like whatever element this one is, it's even heavier. It's probably radioactive at this point. It's undeniably heavy. It's got weight around it. It's almost like dark matter. Like it's heavy and there's a lot spiraling around it. And there's a lot of crackling energy that's going on, that's swirling around this thing. It's just got a lot more going on there. So that's why it's fourth wave. And then by the time we get to 1999, still in the fourth wave, but we've evolved a little bit off of Paranoid Android. And this is more just to say that some people in the 90s might have thought that Paranoid Android was some kind of peak or pinnacle, and nobody could possibly top this or take it even further in different directions. And I'm here to tell you that Ben Christophers, which we talked about in 1999, definitely did with his track Give Me Everything on My Beautiful Demon. So Give Me Everything sounds like Paranoid Android, 100%. It's why it's fourth wave. But it's taking a lot of the three miracles stapled together idea, just so many amazing things going on. It's so heavy, it's so electrified, it's so charged, and yet Ben Christophers has polished the idea up even more, and it just sounds softer, more cohesive, less obviously energized. Like it's still got a lot of energy in it, but it seems like it's been polished up even more, where Paranoid Android was more like a deeply intense project that was worked on by Radiohead to create this wonderful thing, Give Me Everything is like if someone recreated the project in about half the time. So it's not nearly as astounding and a triumph as Paranoid Android was because it was more created, newly fresh, where Give Me Everything is a recreation of the project and a slight evolution off of it. But it's clear that Ben Christophers did it more effortlessly than Radiohead did because he clearly learned something from what they did. And he was just recreating those ideas and then taking them maybe a half step further, which is why it's moving down the path of fourth wave, but it's definitely not its own thing into fifth wave. No way. But that's basically the whole thing to a T. So having said that, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Did you agree with my journey from the very beginning of grunge all the way through post-grunge and they all connect together? Did you disagree with what I said about American football being any way relevant to this? Or did you agree that Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness was basically an Encyclopedia Britannica of grunge and post-grunge in one gigantic album? Maybe. Did you disagree with what I said about what the trajectory of neo-Brit rock was and what we can expect going into the 2000s, or do you agree with it? Did you disagree with me using Sugar Ray to elicit the final point on neo-roots rock? Maybe. That one probably isn't very contentious because it was an all right example, but like I said, by the time we get to 95, like it just totally evaporated into other things, the neo-roots rock movement. So the fact that Sugar Ray was even pulling the thread on that is interesting, and again, it might just sort of show his academic understanding of rock music, but a point elicited nonetheless. What did I miss? As I said at the beginning, I have to have missed a bunch of stuff, and I would encourage you to go look at my 90s recap big playlist when I drop it to see if maybe you find something there that you thought that I missed, but I actually just didn't regard it because maybe the genre or subgenre didn't evolve enough over the 90s. So check that out. But if I have missed something critically fundamental that also isn't Western Underground rock, because that's a separate episode, then feel free to let me know. Send me comments, send me hate mail, do whatever you want. What'd you learn? Did you learn about the trajectory from grunge all the way through post-grunge and how there was connective tissue that bound it all together? Did you learn something about the trajectory of neo-psychedelic rock or apparently chemistry? Because that's the direction that we're going today, maybe? Hopefully, maybe. Check out your periodic table of elements if you're really curious, I guess. But hopefully you learned something today other than a science class. Because I am no scientist and I'm definitely not a chemist. So don't listen to me when it comes to talking about electrons and protons and neutrons, because I did okay in science in high school, but not super great. So don't take my word for it. So before we go, make sure that if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I talked about in today's episode, please check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of today's episode. Please make sure that you join us again for our next episode in this 90s recap series, because there's still more of them to come. Make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening so that other people can find this. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod and subscribe so that you don't miss these series recap episodes that we're dropping until we get to the end of them. And then eventually we start the 2000s with season 3. So make sure that you're subscribed and finding us on social media so you don't miss that. Make sure you tell everybody, tell people you know and don't know, because I'd like to believe there's a lot of people out there that were listening to rock music on the radio in the 90s that might benefit from listening through the evolution and the trajectory, because I would say most of the music, other than if you were listening to alternative pop or any kind of pop music in Western society at the time, there's so much music that I've listed off here that is shut your brain off music, because so many of these songs you're very, very familiar with, probably if you were listening to music in the 90s. And as a result, you just listen to the song, you say, yep, it's Paranoid Android. I know what that sounds like. I'm not going to process it at all because I've heard it so many times. It's not novel to me. But it gives you an opportunity, or these people that you're talking to, an opportunity to really sit down and process what they're listening to, maybe the first time in 30 years, because it's been that long, surprisingly. And it's a gift. It's a gift that you can give those people so that maybe they can go back and appreciate this music newly, freshly, from a different perspective. And that's such a gift that we can give to people. And at the same time, people that are interested in understanding where the roots of some of the popular music that's happening now is connected back to in the 90s, because, you know, we kind of went through a 90s moment over the last 10, 15 years or so. Talking about the 18 to 20 year rule, I think we're a little bit beyond the 90s at this point, but even still, it's probably still fresh in a lot of young people's minds about what was going on in the 90s that might have gotten us to these moments that maybe we won't necessarily make the same thought mistake about Pearl Jam and 10 and how this is a totally new, fresh idea. And it's not just very directly connected to retro roots ideas and Americana rock ideas. And like I said, Allman Brothers and things like that. Maybe we can help educate those people and say, no, this didn't come from nowhere. It came from this. So maybe we can help them out a little bit. And the only way that we can really do that is to say, yeah, I get it. You listened to this music a ton when you were a kid, or you never really thought that any of this music of today had any roots back to any of this other rock music. And maybe it's a little bit older, or maybe it's a little bit outside your bubble at this point, but give it your time, because for the crowd of people that have heard this music ad nauseum to a degree that they just shut their brain off when they hear My Hero or Tonight Tonight or Smells Like Teen Spirit or Morning Glory or Jeremy or Paranoid Android, frankly, like any of that stuff, that you can sit down and appreciate it newly, even if you've heard it 100 million times before, and you know all the words, and you know where all the riffs come in, you know all the little affectations that make the song unique in that individual recording in that moment. You know everything there is to know about all of these bands, because when you were a kid, you researched them obsessively pre-internet. And so you know everything there is to know, right? But I'm sure that there's still one more thing that you could learn. And the only way that you can engage with all this stuff is to realize that it's not necessarily scary. It might be overly familiar, but it's just popular rock music. Thanks for listening, everybody.